Welcome to the Free Library of Philadelphia. I'm Andy Cahan, Director of Author Events, and I am excited to introduce our guest. The National Poet Laureate of Scotland from 2016 to 2021, Jackie Kay is the author of the celebrated poetry collections Life Mask, Off Color, and The Adoption Papers, winner of the Scottish Arts Council Book Award. She is also the author of Red Dust Road, a coming-of-age memoir of being a mixed-race adopted daughter of communists in 1970s Scotland, as well as several plays, children's books, and the novel Trumpet, winner of the Guardian Fiction Prize. In Bessie Smith, a poet's biography of a blues legend, Kay combines history with personal narrative to offer a layered account of the life of the Empress of the Blues, which Bernardine Evaristo calls imaginative, beautifully written, unputdownable, and unforgettable. Jackie Kay, it's an honor to have you join us. The screen is yours.
Well, thank you, Andy. It's great to be in Philadelphia virtually. Thank you, everybody out there for joining us. We're waiting. We're having a little bit of difficulty, so we're waiting for Sapphire to join. We're hoping that she will any moment now. But until then, I'm going to just wing it, and I'm going to start actually by reading this poem that I wrote called "The Red Graveyard." I read that Bessie had lots of relationships with very violent men. And in this poem, I imagine all the violent men are all together in the same graveyard, the red graveyard. It was a kind of pleasing image. There are some stones that open in the night like flowers, down in the red graveyard where Bessie haunts her lovers. There are stones that shake and weep in the heart of night, down in the red graveyard where Bessie haunts her lovers. Why do I remember the blues? I am 5 or 6 or 7 in the back garden. Her window is wide open. Her voice is slow motion through the heavy summer air. Jelly roll, kitchen man, sausage roll, frying pan. Inside the house where I used to be myself, her voice claims the rooms. In the best rooms even, something has changed the shape of my silence. Why do I remember her voice and not my own mother's? Why do I remember the blues? My mother's voice, what was it like? A flat stone for skitting, an old rock, long, long grass, asphalt, wind, hail, cotton, linen, salt, treacle. I think it was a peach. I heard it down to the rib stone. I'm coming down the stairs in my parents' house. I'm 5 or 6 or 7. There was fat, thick wallpaper I always caress, bumping flower into flower. She is singing. Did they play anyone else ever? My father's feet tap a shiny beat in the floor. Christ, my father says, that's some voice she's got. I pick up the record cover, and now this is slow motion. My hand swoops, glides, swoops again. I pick up the cover and my fingers are all over her face, her black face, her magnificent black face. That's some voice, his shoes dancing on the floor. There are some stones that open in the night like flowers, down in the red graveyard where Bessie haunts her lovers. There are stones that shake and weep in the heart of night, down in the red graveyard where Bessie haunts her lovers. Well, it was really interesting writing this book, and it actually was first published in 1997 by a small independent press, Absolute Press. It got very little attention, almost no reviews at the time. So it's interesting to have it republished now, and wonderful that it's been published in the States and with vintage. It's kind of fantastic. The cover in the States is very different to this cover here. In the UK, this reissue here, I haven't yet got my hands on the American copy. It hasn't arrived yet. I wrote a brand new introduction to this book, and so I'm going to read you just a little bit from the introduction. I first really became a huge kind of fan of Bessie at the age of 12. My dad bought me my very first ever double album, Any Woman's Blues, and I kind of fell in love with those blues narratives right then and there, aged 12. And my dad used to sing Nobody knows you when you're down and out. I'm in Edinburgh at the moment in a hotel, but I was in a bar earlier tonight, and there was a guy singing in the bar, and he happened to be singing "Nobody Knows You When You're Down and Out." So I thought that was an extraordinary thing. But the way that my dad sang it always had something particular. So I'm just going to read you this little bit from the introduction. I can see my dad, who died last year, sitting in his armchair singing "Nobody Knows You When You're Down and Out." I can see him relishing the words, the notion that people are fickle and that capitalism is a sham. I can see the enjoyment of the philosophy that's in the blues. There's something egalitarian and equalizing about the blues. There are salutary lessons to be found. There's a terrible reckoning in the space between once I lived and now, and there's nobody to save you. Falling so low is something that might have been predicted, no place to go. It seemed to me, in the way that my dad sang Bessie, that everyone who had ever been poor without ever being rich could yet understand the falling from grace and could empathize. Everyone might intuit the shallowness of the well-to-do. Everyone might sympathize with the trauma of being left on your Todd to cope with whatever after having had friends. The story of the blues, Bessie's blues, going from something to nothing, from having happiness to being wretched, from having love to losing it, from feeling fetid to being ignored. Those terrible trajectories were all around us. They were real life. The reason that I loved the blues was because they didn't appear to me to be made up in any way. They sprang from life's source, life's true well, and well, they tapped into the well of loneliness on the way, allowed for a kind of transformation, a becoming. If you can recognize the other in you, the other side, then perhaps your life can be meaningful in some way you hadn't yet imagined. Blues led the way. It's hard to think of so much music, jazz, rap, house, without the blues coming first. We can trace the etymology of the blues, the brilliant blues bloodline, and find it riveting, fascinating, like going onto a genealogy site and finding ancestors. The blues singers are the ancestral voice, the one that can be heard still, those hauntings, those defiant, mournful calls. Bessie's blues are bang up to the minute. She calls, and across the years and miles, we respond. So I wrote that introduction to this new edition of the book just last year. And it was interesting when I wrote that introduction to think about how relevant the blues are and still, and how there's nothing really happening today that would shock Bessie, not the floods, not the terrible loss of money, not the sudden illnesses. Perhaps the thing that would shock her most is me being on Zoom here in Edinburgh and you being wherever you are, and Sapphire hopefully any minute being in Philadelphia, well, in New York via Philadelphia. Perhaps that would shock her technology, but everything else is there in the blues, and that kind of fascinated me. So I grew up in an all-white part of Glasgow, and I kind of made out of the blues singers, and not just Bessie, but other blues singers too. I kind of made them into this imaginary family. So I'm just going to read a little bit from that part of the book from the very beginning. And this is called In the House of the Blues. I was adopted in 1961 and brought up in a suburban house in a suburban street in the north of Glasgow, a small semi-detached wimpy house. Outside our house is a cherry blossom tree that is as old as me. It doesn't seem the most likely place to be introduced to the blues, but then blues travel to wherever the blues lovers go. In my street and in the neighbouring streets to Brackenbury Avenue, I never saw another Black person. There was my brother and me. That was it. The butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker were all white, although I never actually met a candlestick maker as anyone. So the first time I saw Bessie Smith, it really was like finding a friend. I saw her before I heard her. My father, a Scottish communist who loved the blues, bought me my first double album. I was 12. The album was called Bessie Smith, Any Woman's Blues, and produced by CBS Records, John Hammond and Chris Albertson. Albertson went on to write her biography. I remember taking the album off him and poring over it. examining it for every detail. Her image on the cover captivated me. She looked so familiar. She looked like somebody I already knew in my heart of hearts. I stared at the image of her, trying to recall who it was she reminded me of. She looked so sorrowful and so strong. She would stand up for herself, so she would. She wouldn't take any insults from people. I could see from her eyes that she was a fighter. I put her down and I picked her up. I stroked her proud, defiant cheeks. I ran my fingers across her angry eyebrows. I soothed her. Sometimes I felt shy staring at her, as if she was somehow able to see me looking. On the front cover, she was smiling, every feature of her face lit up by a huge grin, bursting with personality, her eyes full of hilarity, her wide mouth full of laughing teeth. On the back, she was sad, her mouth shut, eyes closed, eyebrows furrowed. The album cover was like a strange two-sided coin, the two faces of Bessie Smith. I knew from that first album that I'd made a friend for life. My favorite of the lot was Dirty No-Gooders Blues. It sounded so bad. The very name made you think things you weren't supposed to be thinking at that age. A dirty no-gooder? What was he? Some man that said filthy words and had no morals. Some man who could not be good. Some man who dedicated his whole life to being bad. I found the blues so exciting because the characters were real characters, people who behaved badly, who did terrible things, who killed and murdered and went to prison and missed Chicago and took it right back to the place where you want to, wherever it was. The men in the blues were low down and rotten, cheating and lying and lazy. There's 19 men living in my neighborhood. There's 19 men living in my neighborhood. 18 of them are fools, and the one ain't no doggone good. At the age of 12, in my small suburban street, the idea of describing men in this way was scandalous, hilarious. Mr. Aird, Mr. Tweedy, Mr. Dunsmore, Mr. Mackintosh, Mr. Murray, Mr. Kerr, Mr. Cochrane. Which one was no doggone good? Whenever I listened to the lyrics of the blues, they made me feel like I was being entrusted with a secret. I was being told a secret story about some no good, no count man. The story was for me and not for him. The story was a joke on him. Bessie Smith was singing for women. It was women who were singing those blues, and the lyrics were mainly about the 101 ways a man could let you down. I guess I took the warning. Every woman could understand the blues. I realized I could always choose to have Bessie Smith in my life, that she was not going to betray me or go off with another friend or move to Kirkintilloch or suddenly turn nasty. Nobody could take her away from me. And when I grew up and went away, I could take her with me, and I did. And so I've taken her with me really all my life. So that was, from when I was 12, and I'm now nearly 60. Tell me I don't look that old. Tell me I don't look old enough. But yes, I've taken her with me, and I find it really fascinating the ways in which the people that we love, whether they be writers or artists or singers or musicians, how they've become part of our own identity, and how without them and without the love of them, we would be quite different people. And so I was interested when I wrote Bessie to try and write about that intersection, to write about my life and to write about hers at the same time. And trying to write about her life was kind of an interesting conundrum, because so much, apart from reading different books that had chapters in them about her and reading Chris Albertson's biography, there are huge missing gaps in her life, partly because her husband, Jack G, destroyed so much of the information that we might have had available to us. So that meant that I decided to try and envisage and imagine her voice, to put her right in the street corner and to create a voice for her. And I found the more that I wrote in that voice for her, which is some part of the book, probably the parts of the book that I enjoyed writing the most, the more I got close to kind of an imaginative truth. And I thought that there is, it might be something interesting to discuss later when we get to ask questions, but there is such a thing as imaginative truth. So I imagine her, there she was, age 9, singing on street corners. She'd been born in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Her mother died by the time she was 9 and her father was dead too. So she was born very, very poor, and she grew up in a ramshackle cabin, she described it as, where the rats outnumbered the children. And so she had to try and make some money, and she earned nickels and dimes on the street corner on 9th Street in Chattanooga. And then when she was a little bit older, 19, she joined the Mosey Stokes traveling show. Really, her brother Clarence helped her to do that, and she then traveled around with Ma Rainey and other blues women. And then in 1923, she had her first record released, and that sold, Downhearted Blues, sold 780,000 records. And so she went from being very poor to very rich, and then back to being very poor. And so her life really had the same trajectory, that nobody knows you when you're down and out. It really could have been a song for her. She sang her own life before she knew that that was exactly what was going to happen to her. And, you know, there's so many things that fascinate me about Bessie, that she had relationships with men and with women, and that she was kind of very open really about having her relationships with women. I've got a wee message coming in. Yes, she's very, very. All right, we're going to hear Sapphire, but not see her. So that's great. So hopefully that will happen soon.
Okay, here we go.
Great.
Hey, hi Jackie. How are you?
Hey Sapphire, I'm fine. How are you?
Hey, good. I'm glad, you know, however this happens, I'm gonna throw this computer out the window. Listen, I have so many questions. And I have not heard what went before. So I'm just gonna go ahead and start with some things that were on my mind. And I was thinking about, for all of Bessie's strong physicality and presence, she had in many ways a very fragile sense of self. And you talk about that on page 115. You imagine her saying to Ruby, "I will destroy you, bitch, before I let you." The feeling is almost the fear of appropriation or being possessed by outside demons that people find in people who have psychotic breaks. And there was also her unwillingness to share the stage at certain points in her career with other blues artists. Can you talk about that? Because here we have this demon of a fierce woman who just is at the same time very, very fragile.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting point to start from. And the thing that sort of fascinated me about Bessie, the more I learned about her, that she was so complex. You know, on the one hand, she was this really strong woman, and she didn't take any shit from anybody, and she would fight for her rights in all sorts of different situations. And on the other hand, she was very, very fragile. She suffered from a lot of depression, and she would go from being extraordinarily depressed to actually exhilarated in short spaces of time. I think she developed very quickly a sense of her own self-worth, and she felt like that she could sing the blues like nobody else. So she didn't particularly like being put on bills with Ma Rainey and with Clara Smith and with Laura Smith, and she just didn't really like sharing the stage, and was quite ungenerous in lots of ways to the other blues women. But yet she was very generous to other people in all sorts of different ways. So she was so complex, and she takes such a lot of unpicking. But that's what I find so fascinating about her. We tend to kind of characterize people as becoming tragic, and particularly a lot of Black women. And when you watch biopics of Black women musicians, they often tell this terribly tragic story, and they don't capture the defiance. They capture the vulnerability and the fragility often, but not the defiance and not the strength. So I was interested really in trying to do both in this book and capture all of her, the bits that were likable and the bits that were not.
I think that you did capture that. There was another point in the book, early on in the book, you're looking at some of the cruelty and the absurdity of racism, with the white actors creating caricatures of Blacks using the burnt cork to blacken their faces. and they were received better on stage with this farcical black stage. But yet we have the incident, which is, it's famous by now, but I'd like to hear you talk about it, with Irving Miller, and he throws Bessie Smith out of his chorus line for being too black. And later in the book, there's an incident where we hear about Bessie and her response years and years later, which shows her strength and her agency when someone instructs her to get rid of her black skin dancers. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's fascinating. In fact, when Bessie first tried to record with OK Records, they didn't go ahead because they decided that she was too rough, because she interrupted the recording by saying, "Hold on, let me spit." And then it was Columbia Records that actually took her on. She had a really strong sense of being a working class Black woman, and she wasn't going to really change her ways and become what she thought of as kind of uppity Black, but nor was she going to be embarrassed or ashamed of her color. And she was very, very strongly proud of her color. And so it was really distressing for her that she was thrown out of a chorus line for being too dark. And it was even more distressing later in her life when Jack G not only betrayed her, but set up a rival concert with a much lighter skinned woman. I think that was the thing that was the final straw for Bessie. But she did fight for her chorus girls and for her dark-skinned chorus girls. And she did have a real sense of the kind of colorism that exists at the time, where other middle-class Black people would kind of look down at her, not just because she was darker, but also because she was a blues singer. And there became a kind of a snobbery towards the blues, as if they were just too working class, and people were already kind of starting.
Absolutely. And there was also the issue in that much of the Black middle class in America was made up of Christians. And for Christians in the North and the South, in the very beginning, the blues and the people who were associated with the blues were associated with the devil. They were associated with almost a kind of a demon worship and alcoholism and drugs and hypersexuality. So that is part of it. But I wanted to talk about something else. While we talk about her rivalry with the other artists and things, I don't think we have many examples as female artists today that we have of teaching and mentoring and the kidnapping maybe of Ma Rainey, of Ma Rainey kidnapping Bessie Smith. I don't know if that really happened. What I do know is that when I look through pictures of Bessie Smith and Ma Rainey, Bessie Smith's first pictures are dressed. She is dressed almost exactly like Bessie Smith, like Ma Rainey, in these draped dresses and stuff. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between the mother of the blues and the Empress of the blues? These two women really are the foundation for much of Black American music.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, there is this amazing story about Ma Rainey going down to the South and kidnapping Bessie, and hearing about this girl in the South and saying, "I've got to get that girl," and going and bringing her back up north, which actually apparently was completely untrue. Although in the book, I kind of have fun trying to imagine what that kidnapping would be like. And at first when Bessie started singing with Ma, I think Ma took her under her wing, and Ma was like a mentor to Bessie. She taught her a lot of what she knew. She taught her how to perform, how to be comfortable on the stage. Bessie knew how to sing. She knew how to time her songs. She had a kind of real talent, but the performing and actually appearing on the stage and everything, she learned really a lot from Ma Rainey, and the famously gold-toothed Ma Rainey. And Ma took a great pride in Bessie initially, and I think the relationship was very close initially. And then as Bessie became even more famous than Ma, and her blues sold more than Ma's, I think that relationship became troubled. And Bessie also wanted to assert her own independence. Perhaps she felt as if she was being kept in some way, in a kind of All About Eve type way. And I think she wanted to just break out. So there was just such a lot of, it's just such a complex relationship. It's interesting when you watch the recent film of Ma Rainey, which only gives you a snapshot anyway of a couple of days in her life, but you get no real sense in that of the other blues women at the time, and the relationships
Exactly.
and
Yeah.
the relationships with each other.
Mhm. Well, I think you show that, and I think it's a very, very important part of the book. One of the things that happens in the book is that we're caught with you as a researcher and as a writer in that space between information, research, and imagination. And imagination allows you to approach the unknown. There are some things that we will just never know. And on pages 74 through 80, we approach through imagination, and it's a beautiful riff, the lost trunk. Can you tell us a little bit about that, or read it?
Yeah, thank you, Sapphire.
I love that part,
you.
Jackie.
Oh, well, I love that you're so specific with your page numbers. That is really impressive. But yeah, it's lovely, and it's lovely to talk to you, by the way. It's just great to hear your voice. But yeah, the Lost Trunk, I will read a little bit of this, because you know the trunk, Jack G. I was saying this just a little minute before you appeared, but I didn't go into in detail that Jack G destroyed such a lot of stuff that was in this trunk, and it's you know, it's every biographer's nightmare, that kind of violence. So not only was he violent to her when she was alive, but he was violent to her when she was dead, because he kind of really changed her legacy. So I decided to try and imagine what might be in this trunk, and to actually put things there and get the trunk sent to Scotland. And I found that whole process of imagining.
Read it to us, Jackie.
Quite healing. I'm going to read it. I was just explaining it. Yeah, I'm going to read it. Okay. So I'll read a bit of it. Yeah. Okay. Before they died, Tinny and Viola, that's her sisters, sent it on a ship heading for Scotland. They'd seen pictures of Scotland and liked the look of the country, those big goddamn mountains. Could send Jack up one of those and he'd never come down, Ben Nevis. They didn't want Jack to get his hands on that trunk, ever. He was a dirty no-gooder, and Bessie should have known better. She ought never to have married the skunk. A note to this effect is found 60 years later, signed by both of them. Tinny's writing is perfect calligraphy, and Viola's is in big childish print. Inside, an old photograph of the shack in Chattanooga, where Bessie was born. Nobody is standing outside it. It is just a shack. It is dark and leaning to the left. The window is partly boarded up. The door is flung open like somebody just left in a hurry. It's been taken on a bright day. The bright sunlight has blanched out some bits of the roof. An early daguerreotype of Bessie Smith's mother and her father. She favors her mother, got her nose and her chin, and especially her eyes, but she's inherited the shape of her father's face. Her mother and father are standing side by side, and the electricity between them is still there in the image. An old poster advertising the two assassinators of the blues in the Moses Stokes traveling show, yellow and curled at the edges. Another picture of Bessie herself standing on the corner of 9th Street singing. A baby tooth next to a wisdom tooth, which has its long roots still also attached, wrapped in newspaper. A bottle of bootleg liquor and a pint glass with a lipstick imprint of the lips of the Empress. A horsehair wig, shiny black hair that was once long ago ran all the way down to the round shoulders of Bessie Smith. A strand of pearls and imitation rubies. A satin dress. Headgear that looks like a lampshade in someone's front room with lots of tassels hanging down. A plain dress with beaded fringes. A Spanish shawl. A skull cap with beads and pearls sewn into it. Feathers. Ostrich plumes. An ermine coat. A giant bottle of Coca-Cola. A notebook in Bessie's handwriting of all of her blues compositions. A letter full of curses, again in Bessie's handwriting, to the manager of the 91 Club in Atlanta. An original record of Downhearted Blues. A reject selection of the songs that were never released. A giant pot of chicken stew still steaming, its lid tilted to the side. A photograph of Ethel Waters. Underneath a sophisticated image, Bessie has written, "Northern bitch, long goodie, Sweet Mama Stringbean, 1922. A photograph of Ruby. Bessie has written all over her face with words that are impossible to decipher. Another photograph of Ruby, untouched, in a sexy pose and wearing a polka dot dress with separate sleeves and a string of pearls. A jar of Harlem night air. a blues for Ruby, a blues so raunchy it will become a lesbian classic. Every lesbian singer will make a recording of it. Sometime in the future, technology will be so sophisticated, a recording will be made of Bessie Smith singing Ruby's blues. They will have succeeded in cutting a whole new blues by piecing together words from her previous songs and connecting them digitally. Bessie's version will outsell anyone else's, including Katie Lang's. And it goes on. So I'll probably stop it just there. That gives you an idea of some of the things that I imagined were in that trunk.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's a beautiful riff. There's something I want to go back to that's more than a little difficult. Years ago, the white jazz musician Artie Shaw hired Billie Holiday for gigs, and they went to a hotel, and I believe it was here in New York. But the hotel was practicing segregation, and Artie Shaw went through the front door, and he instructed Bessie Smith. He instructed Billie Holiday to go through the back door. And she talked about that almost till the day she died, how humiliating that was, how angry that was. And we have an incident similar to that on page 99. White and Black people, those segregated, crowded into those tents to hear the blues. Bessie Smith gave many performances in white theaters where she changed neither the style of her music nor its content. She refused to water herself down. And so she had that moment of that defiance, but she also, in those theaters, could not use the toilet. So I'm just trying to think of how she was able to reconcile this with her psyche. They're clapping for you on the stage. You're breaking the box office, and at the same time you're in these theaters, and you cannot use the same facilities that the white artists do. So what effect do you think toggling between these two worlds, white and Black, segregated, desegregated, North and South, had on her?
Well, I think it had an enormous effect. That kind of the toxicity of that racism had an enormous effect, really, on all Black people. Bessie Smith, when she died, her coffin was sent on a train, and it was sent in the segregated bit of the train. So even when she was dead, she was in the Black bit of the train. And she tried to kind of circumvent some of that racism by getting her very own Pullman train. And she did that in order to avoid Jim Crow racism, and in order not to have to keep going in the back door of these rooming houses where she was meant to stay. And so that was a kind of act of defiance. And on her train, she had the whole crew. She would cook for them. She'd cook pig's feet stews and stews from the South. And she loved that train. And when that train came into the South, people would say, Bessie's in town. And everybody loved it because it was a huge uplifting thing for people to see this blues woman defying kind of Jim Crow segregation and racism. But for those times when she performed in tents that were segregated, and in venues where, as you say, she couldn't use the toilet, what did that actually do to her psyche? What does that do to you when you're partly going along with something by just being there? What does it do to you? And I think it was very corrosive. I think that culminated for her when she was invited to Karl van Vechten's party in Haarlem, and it was one of those kind of parties where they actually asked her where there was kind of a lot of white patronizing patrons there, and this woman, Karl van Vechten's tiny wife, came up and kissed Bessie on the cheek and said, "Darling, will you sing the blues?" And Bessie was so outraged at this that she knocked her straight to the floor. And she felt really, really angry that she was kind of being made into this kind of performing person at a party, and she had to kind of down a whole pint of gin, and before she did, I think, eventually sing that night, but not without having created this kind of amazing, or not having responded, if you like, rather than created, having responded to this dire situation. And I think that was why Bessie was so violent as well, because sometimes she couldn't articulate how she was feeling about the contradictions in her life, about being feted in the one hand and treated abysmally on the other. And those contradictions really got to her. They really got her down.
Yeah, I think they were soul breaking in many ways. I was able to many years ago, and several times I was able to see Big Mama Thornton, who
Oh, wow, really? Wow.
Yes. So Big Mama Thornton was a singer. She was also an out lesbian. And there, and when I read on page 120, you're talking about, did she marry a man because she feared her own lesbianism? I think, when I look at Big Mama Thornton, I see a very different person than I saw and see with Bessie Smith. And I'm thinking, one of the things that they've come out with is that no group of people have suffered in the gay and lesbian community have suffered worse mental health than bisexual people. So that lesbians are okay, straight people are okay, but the women who are caught in between, and it does seem to me that her relationships with men were very dysfunctional. But it does seem like Bessie Smith was into men. She loved women, and she was also into men. Whereas Big Mama Thornton, all she had for a man was a 38. You know what I mean? So she was not ambivalent about her sexuality. She was not bisexual. But what do you think that this? Because there were some genuine, deep feelings. With when Jack left, she was. This is not the type of feelings you have when you are married to what we call a beard, someone who hides your true face.
Yeah.
Genuine and deep feelings for both sexes. Now, I think she had a level of comfort with females that she didn't have with males, but this was not fake. She loved both of them, and I'm just wondering and there was no language for that at that time, no analysis of that. And I'm wondering, as a person who seemed to me in a lot of ways very split, very divided between the present and the past, poverty and riches. What do you think how do you think she couldn't control? One more thing she couldn't control. Look at a fine little young man and wanted to go with him. Look at a fine little young girl and want to go with her. That's confusing for a lot of people, no matter how sophisticated they are.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. I'm jealous that you got to see Big Mama Thornton. Actually, I just picked
her. Many times. I loved her.
I did a music thing for NTS Radio, and I picked Big Mama Thornton for one of the songs. But yeah, she's amazing. I'd love to have seen her live. I'd have loved to have seen Bessie live. I mean, if there was any time that I could return to, it would be those 1920s Harlem times and go to one of these Buffy Flat parties, because at these Buffy Flat or Buffett Flat, however you pronounce it there, and these parties had women having sex with men, women having sex with women, and men having sex with men, and they were very very open. Nobody seemed to mind about it. We're 100 years later, and we're still kind of worrying about issues of sexuality and how to define ourselves. I don't think that Bessie had a problem with loving women and men. I don't think she found it particularly confusing. I think she thought of them as different loves, different things, and that she was attracted to women in slightly different ways than men. I don't think, I mean, it's very difficult to know because we don't have any evidence for any of it, but I don't think that she would have felt confused, because she seemed to just accept that she loved women and men. The problem was that Jack didn't like her loving women, and that she, he would often come and beat her up and disrupt the party. So she was frightened of Jack because he was violent, but at the same time, you're absolutely right. She loved him. She absolutely loved him, and she was broken when he left for this other lighter skinned woman and left and destroyed her relationship with her adopted son and took him away and stole Jack G. Jr. and all the rest of it. I mean, But she loved him. She loved him maybe because he once bought her a red dress, and she loved Ruby too, in a different way.
Yeah, and the red dress is really a painful incident in terms of that he really never did anything else again for her. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. That was it. That's all he had to do.
I mean, it really shows the paucity of this relationship and grateful she was for crumbs.
I know, it's sad, but she'd never been.
The siblings lived off of her. The men lived off of her. The girl lived off of her. So again, we come to this magnificent person with this battered, beaten sense of self-esteem that buys someone a $5,000 Cadillac and is grateful for a dress.
I know. There's something heartbreaking about that, and it was really because she'd been from such a poor, working class childhood where she hadn't had shoes. She'd never been bought a dress in her life. So when he bought her the first red dress, she wore it to her first recording, and she believed that red dress alone brought her all the luck. She was quite superstitious, and she went to visit him in hospital and everything, and it was all her love for him was all connected with just being bought this one present that she absolutely loved. And yeah, and she bought him, as you say, Cadillac. Every time he had a kind of nervous breakdown, he would go off to these retreats and spas that she would pay for. She tolerated all sorts of money from a man who was actually, he wanted to be a policeman, but he wasn't a policeman. He was a kind of night watchman. And his thing that he liked to do was just counting towers of her money. And everybody in her life, her sisters were really into her money. She bought them a house each. And then when she became poor after the Wall Street crash, and blues lovers went away and started liking jazz, and the whole situation changed, they all deserted her, and they were all, even her own sisters deserted her, as you say. So that must have been so hard for her to think that her popularity with her own sisters and with Jack was dependent on how much she was earning. A bit like the song, I was talking about that earlier, Nobody Knows You When You're Down and Out.
It's fantastic. And the way you link that in the book is fantastic also. I'm thinking about it's not until 1956 that the American Medical Association recognizes alcoholism as a disease and as a progressive disease that without interruption leads to death. And I'm thinking about so many from Charlie Parker to just so many, just Billie Holiday, so many talented artists. And we're really looking at people caught in the end stage of disease when we look at some of the breaks and the violence. I believe that Bessie Smith found herself surrounded by and perpetrating and being the recipient of, because she was also the recipient of great violence. So I wondered if you could speak about that.
Yeah, I think, that when you're subject to violence, it dramatically changes your self-esteem, your sense of self and your self-worth. And it makes your positioning really on the planet Earth tentative rather than definite, because you never know where the next blow is coming from, or if that blow is actually going to kill you or finish you off. So you live on a kind of a knife edge where anything could happen at any time, and a nice day could suddenly turn into a nightmare, and just like that. And I think Bessie lived like that so often. I mean, Jack would come all the way down to where she was performing and beat her. One time she actually threw herself down the stairs to stop him from beating her. And she had and she was violent to herself to try and anticipate what he might be doing. I think that relationship to violence and to people being violent to you is really, really complex and horrendous. And we're still seeing that, today, where we're seeing epidemics of violence against women in this country, in the UK. I mean, and there's a lot of talk about that at the moment. It's so, depressing that, 100 years after we're talking about Bessie having her heyday, that there still is this kind of endemic misogynist violence against women. And it's just, it's so interesting to try and think of what can be done and how to tackle it. And in the book, I was really interested in trying to explore some of that, some of the violence, and also trying to explore it. I noticed that one of the questions that's come up on the chat is about poetry. It says, how does Bessie speak to you as a poet? Can you talk about the poetry in her music? And I was fascinated by the idea that Bessie wrote a lot of songs herself. Of the 160 recordings that she made, 37 of them she wrote herself. And a lot of these were actually about violence. They were about violence that was done to her. And she managed to find a way to sort of articulate through the blues her own story. There was nothing kind of made up in that. That's why I think the blues are still so relevant today, because they tell, in these times when people can't distinguish truth from fiction, fake news from real news, the blues tell it like it is, these authentic stories of what actually happened to her. And Bessie, I kind of try and imagine her, what that must have been like, because she wasn't that literate. So even when she wrote her own blues, she had to kind of memorize them, because she couldn't trust herself to read from her own writing and sing at the same time. And nonetheless, I think that she got a lot from writing about the things that were happening to her and telling her story. And similarly for me, I have got a lot, and I don't think I'd be alive today had I not found a way to write in some way about my different experiences. And I found that poetry is a form that comes in and holds your hand in the darknesses and accompanies you through all sorts of things, as I'm sure you've found, Sapphire, too, being a poet yourself and being a writer yourself. That I'm interested in asking you that question, if how you've found writing about your life or other things that happened to you, if you've found that helpful in a way through your life.
I have found it to be very helpful. I have found writing to be a way of transmuting, for me, trauma. There's many ways to deal with trauma, and how the culture I was raised in deals with it is denial. And denial allows people to function, but eventually it cracks the vessel that is holding it. So I have been able to use the medium of poetry to express trauma, to express my own trauma, to express the generational trauma, and to celebrate. There's been the trauma, but there's also been the celebration, and there's been the effect. I think in the same way that singing and dancing, I love dancing, all of that has
when I first met you, Sapphire, you were dancing. So that was like 40 years ago, and it's kind of amazing to think of coming to watch you dance in London, and how exciting that was. How thrilling. Because to me, your dance is also poetry. Is a way of your body. It's like your body inhabiting a poem. Your dance.
For me, it is. I think it's different for every person, but for me, it was one more extension. You know what I mean? And dance and poetry and song literally rebuild the brain. They rebuild the synapses. They rebuild the parts of the brain that have been destroyed in trauma. Trauma limits us and really literally shrinks the white matter. You know what I mean? And it's through art that we can begin to rebuild ourselves. And that because you've taught in so many different venues, what it is when we take these workshops into the homeless shelters, into the prisons. People literally get their minds back. They get their minds back.
Exactly. And I think
art is a way of literally building the soul and the psyche and the intellect back, and trauma, the slavery, and I didn't, there's so much in this wonderful book. I didn't even well, I actually did write it all out, but we can't talk about it all. One of the things that happened to Bessie, and that is happening to many artists, is she was, despite her fame and her creativity, she was basically ripped off again and again and again. That is another form of humiliation. The economic oppression that great Black artists have sustained, from Howlin' Wolf to Patton, you know what I mean? To
Yeah. And
yes,
actually, the ultimate,
look at how Elvis Presley lived and died off of Big Mama Thornton's creation.
yeah.
I can just dig him up and bury him again.
Yeah.
All these women, and many of them not literate and not able to, really exercise the full legal right of their work. It's just heartbreaking. That adds one more heartbreak. You're getting your butt beat, and then you're getting your music and your copyrights and all that ripped off. So when we talk about being a survivor, when we talk about Bessie Smith, when we talk about a blues legacy, we're talking about something. We're talking
I think for her, Sapphire, the ultimate humiliation would have been actually having an unmarked grave. And I notice, I don't think you can see these things coming up, but I can see some of the questions. And somebody has asked, can you talk about Bessie's unmarked grave and the circumstances of how she was given a more dignified burial stone? And that's interesting to me, because Bessie, she had an insurance policy that ensured that she had an amazing funeral, and she was very concerned that she didn't have a so-called pauper's funeral, but she would have assumed that one of the members of her family would have at least given her a gravestone, and nobody did. Nobody paid for a gravestone, and she was in an unmarked grave. And if she'd known about that, that would have been the ultimate humiliation. And it wasn't until 1970, Bessie died in 1937. It wasn't until 1970, 33 years later, that Juanita Green, who was the secretary of the NAACP, and Janis Joplin clubbed together in response to a letter in the Philadelphia Inquirer that said, "Why is Bessie Smith in an unmarked grave?" That they both joined together and got the money and made the greatest blues, made a gravestone for her that said, "The greatest blues singer in the world will never stop singing." And that was a really extraordinary thing. But that very same year, 1970, when they did that, Janis Joplin herself died very tragically and suddenly at age 26. But it really sort of, it's Bessie's death, her actual death itself, and what happened immediately after her death, and then 33 years on from her death, also continue the story. And yet when she actually died, there were so many people that wanted to come and visit her. 10,000 people visited her. They had to actually move her body because it wasn't a big enough space for people to kind of flock in and out. And yet none of the famous people that had kind of befriended her and whatever, not one single one of them came to her funeral. But all the people that loved her, for whom she spoke, for whom her songs meant so much, they all came. 10,000 people around the streets. And so that, it's a really extraordinary story to me, and probably another one of the reasons that I love Bessie, that in the end, her life mattered to all these people who she managed to tell their story through her story, and they identified with it. All of these women actually believed that she was singing for them, and they all came. And so it's amazing. The sisters and all these famous people didn't come, and Jack G didn't pay for a gravestone. But then years later, there's Janis Joplin and Juanita Green. So there's something in that's it's a bit like Alice Walker going and paying for a gravestone for Zora Neale Hurston.
For Zora Neale Hurston, exactly.
In 1973, only 3 years later. So Zora Neale, who was also a big figure in the Harlem Renaissance, Zora and Bessie got their gravestones finally around about the same time.
1960, I believe. Yeah, it's an amazing work of art. amazing work of testimony, Jackie, and it's amazing. It's just an amazing biography. I don't know if we have time for you to talk about your research techniques.
Yeah. So one of the other questions is about what the photograph on the cover means to me, and I assume that she's talking about the American cover, and this is the British cover, which is very different. And I quite like that the American cover has Bessie really smiling and looking like she's really enjoying herself, and this cover has her looking more thoughtful. I was talking earlier before you came on, Sapphire, about the two faces of Bessie Smith, but actually there are many faces of Bessie Smith. And when I was doing my research for the book, I was trying to really capture all the different faces of Bessie Smith. One of the things that I did was I went to the Library of Congress, made an appointment in Washington, and I went and watched all these original Zora Neale Hurston films of children street children playing their different games, because there was so little original information about Bessie that I decided to try and find other pieces of information about the times. And so apart from reading lots and lots of blues biographies and listening to her and all of the other blues women over and over and over again, and then reading around people of the time and reading every jazz book going, the main thing that helped me write the book wasn't actually research, it was my imagination. It was trying to get close to an imaginative truth, and I realized that I could just try as a writer and get close to Bessie even when she was dying, to try and think what that accident would have felt like, what having your arm severed would have felt like, what she would have been thinking about in those last minutes. And I tried to do that, and that was as important, if not more important, than the research, because so much had been destroyed, and it would probably take, I don't know, 12, 15 years to uncover any little pieces of things that have been hidden in places. And yeah, so I think that would be very, very difficult to try and find original information. I mean, sometimes things do turn up about people years and years later, and there might still be things that turn up about Bessie. I mean, I hold out hope, but I decided that wasn't the kind of biography that I was going to write anyway, a straightforward biography where you research and then you tell somebody's life. I was more interested really in the intersection between her life and mine, and in the idea of there being a kind of a poetic truth, a lyrical truth, an imaginative truth, and trying to find out what that was.
And you did it.
Hey.
You did it.
Hey. Thank you.
I just want to chime in and thank you both very much for making this work. Wasn't easy, but we got there. Jackie, terrific presentation. Sapphire, wonderful questions. For folks who are interested to get the book, you can get it at Uncle Bobby's. And if you email them, ask for a book plate, they will get a book plate to you and work it out with you. So Jackie K, what a pleasure to have you here talking about who's legend like Bessie Smith. And Sapphire, again, thanks for your time. I hope we'll see you both in Philadelphia at some point, sooner than later.
I hope so too. And thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you for having this hybrid form of Sapphire's voice and my face. It would be quite interesting if we switched Sapphire as well, and I got your voice and you got my face. Because yes, it was.
I love you.
I love you too. Thanks very much. Thanks for joining, reading,
right.
Sapphire.
Good night, all. Thanks, Jack.
Good night, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
Bye-bye.